Henry, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, the starting point that I would love your perspective on is as the world tries to digest the recent US election and the implications for how the US will interface with its allies, its rivals, its other parties around the world, what can we infer from the triangle of who Trump is nominating to be in his cabinet, what the polling data says, and then some of the statements that have been made pre and post election day.
Well, so let me start with the polling data, which is that every poll that asks what was the most important issue in the campaign ranks foreign policy or Ukraine or defense way down the list, like low single digits. So what you should not infer is that the American people were expressly endorsing a dramatic change in policy. This was not a foreign policy election, unless you want to count control of the border with Mexico as a foreign policy issue, in which case that was what was on people's mind. With respect to who he's appointing, he is basically creating a coalition within his cabinet, which is that he has people who are more on the isolationist, hard MAGA line. He has people like Marco Rubio, who have traditionally been more in the conventional Republican internationalist camp, although Rubio, of course, has made his peace with Trump long ago, unlike most people who are in that camp. And then people in between. So I think what he's going to have is a robust discussion. What you will not have in the Trump administration is the default acceptance of neoconservative Bush, Romney, McCain era assumptions. It is clear that this administration is a modification of that, somewhat a rejection. Others want a small movement, but it is at least a modification of that. And that's something that people need to address. And then with respect to the statements, the thing to remember about Trump is he views himself as a deal maker. So when he makes statements, he is making statements to indicate direction and effect. He is not, unlike most people who make hard statements in the world of politics like Trump does, indicating a clear and inalterable policy. So when I look at Trump's statements, what he's saying is, I want peace in Ukraine. Is he saying he won't support Zelensky? No. He's saying, I want peace in Ukraine. And that's something that Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky and me and the Europeans have to hash out. Trying to read more into it than that is misreading Trump. And the same is true with China. Yes, it sounds very hawkish. On the other hand, Trump likes deals. And he's also talked about China's large trade deficit with the United States. Well, one can easily imagine the contours of a sort of deal that would be less hawkish. So what you need to do, as Selena Zito in America said very famously 8 years ago, you need to take him seriously, but not literally.
You said that foreign policy really wasn't one of the main issues that got him elected, that voters were concerned with. My understanding of American history is it's pretty rare that that's the case outside of World War II type of scenarios. The U.S. tends to be pretty insular, pretty focused on what's going on domestically. Have there been many instances recently where foreign policy really was kind of make or break in a presidential election?
No, not really. And so the reason I'm emphasizing this is not to say that this is a change, but rather it's a continuity, because a lot of people around the world say, well, look at Trump. He's saying all these things. Therefore, we should infer. No, what you should infer from Trump is that foreign policy, as is traditional in the United States, except in periods of extreme stress or global confrontation, that directly threaten or are perceived to possibly threaten the United States, that foreign policy is not a major consideration in American voters' choices. It's not to say it's not secondary. It's not to say there's not people with opinions, but this was not a foreign policy election. This was a domestic policy immigration election.
And when you look at the issue-based polling, be it inflation, be it immigration, or also some of these foreign policy issues, when they do the polling on an issues basis with American voters, that my interpretation also tends to have a much bigger effect on the president's actions during a first term, where they're concerned with re-election, they're concerned with the second term. But given that this is Trump's second term, are you expecting him to maybe not be so sensitive to the public polling, or what's your interpretation of that?
I believe that Trump thinks that he has taken everything the world has thrown at him for 9 years and come out on top. And there is a lot of reason to think he's right. And so consequently, I would expect that Trump is going to persist in what he has been communicating over those 9 years. He believes in a fundamental restructuring of trade so that America's consumers no longer subsidize the world's manufacturers. Tariffs are a means to that end. They may be the most favored means, but the direction is we're going to stop consumers from America subsidizing the rest of the world. We're going to push them to subsidizing their own citizens through an American-based economy. He has talked a lot about the United States not subsidizing other nations' military and getting involved in what he perceived to be other nations' conflicts that are secondary to the United States. We should expect him to move in that direction. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean isolationism, but what it does mean is some sort of retraction of America as the arbiter of virtually every global conflict. You can see that with Trump's tweet about Syria. It's not our fight. If you take a very chessboard game, every fight is our fight because every position on the chessboard could impact the next position, which is the traditional neocon view. Trump has never believed that. He doesn't believe it now. You should expect him to move in that direction. And the same is true across the board. Trump believes he's won. And Trump is instinctively a deal maker. He's instinctively a coalition builder through deals rather than through relationships. So I would not expect him to abandon the deal-making coalition aspect of his presidency, but I would expect him to not listen a whole lot to polls, just as he has not listened to polls on these core issues for his entire adult life.
Is there anything that you feel like you learned from this election cycle, since your predictions before the election were pretty darn close to the outcome, which not many of the pollsters out there can say? What did you learn, considering it kind of confirmed what you expected going in?
If you're open to evidence, you're always learning. One thing I learned was that my hunch that I did not include in my predictions, but I hinted at, which is that the country's even more Republican than the polls are setting, that was confirmed. My predictions would have been nearly perfect. It would have been perfect as far as the states. They would have been nearly and perhaps close to being perfect in the popular vote had I gone with my hunch rather than the midpoint of the data. So that is one thing that I learned. Another thing I learned is that electoral coalition is politically inefficient, which is that Trump is now ranking up margins in safe areas and cutting margins in still safe Democratic areas that isn't necessarily electing people to Congress. That, a national electorate of the way that Trump has should have produced a couple more senators and probably about 10 more congressmen. So that's something that I learned. And one of the things that go along with that is a return to ticket splitting, is that for the last decade, we've seen a lot of straight ticket voting, that if you voted for, with a few exceptions of extremely popular or extremely bizarre candidates, if you voted Democrat in one office, you voted Democrat in every office. And the same is true of Republican. We saw a little bit of a return to the pre-2016 model of, well, I'll vote Republican at the top of the ticket, but Democrat at the bottom of the ticket. Nowhere near what we saw even as recently as 2012, but enough to reelect some key Democratic senators and representatives. So those are three things. One thing that was confirmed, two things that were learned, and I'm sure I'll be learning all my life, because this is not an equation. This is human beings, and human beings, while more predictable than some might say in the aggregate or the mass, if you understand a nation's politics and its trends, are never predictable in any degree of permanent precision.